Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. Coming up next on the Assembling Inclusion podcast.
If nothing else happens with this in the next year, this is worth the entire process because that family now understands the resource that's there for them and that we want them in it and that we're going to do what we can to ensure that they're safe and they're comfortable.
On today's show, we're jumping back into a conversation about sensory inclusion by featuring the Cedar Rapids Public Library. I'm talking to Programming Manager Kevin Delecki, and we talked about all the ways that the library has helped to make their space more inclusive of sensory needs, and then we also want to talk about how they're making sure that all of the patrons and community members who come into the library feel accepted within their space. I'm excited to share this episode with you today, so let's dive right in. Hello, and welcome to the Assembly Inclusion podcast. Today, I'm here with Kevin Delecki, the Programming Manager at Cedar Rapids Public Library, and we're going to be talking about the Sensory Inclusion Initiative within the library. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
So, just to start off, what made you want to start the process for getting the library sensory certified?
It's something that we've been looking at in bits and pieces over a number of years, both with interactions that we've had with patrons in our library who either were struggling with noise within a program or an event, or were just running into roadblocks in using our building. We started really seriously looking at it when our senior administrative assistant's daughter was formally diagnosed with autism. And she was able to really start bringing in some of the direct impacts on their family that having places that did not focus on sensory inclusivity really had, as well as pointing out some of the pretty major things that were happening in our library that made it not welcoming for her family and her daughter to be there, and really kind of looking at what that meant for a lot of other families in our community as well. And so that's where we really started the process. That was probably 4 years ago, but we started much more seriously looking at it here in the last couple of years as part of our strategic plan when one of our 3 pillars was inclusion. And we looked at what did that mean for our community, and sensory inclusivity was really one of those first tenets that we looked at as one of those really relatively small impact in terms of doing the work and a huge impact in terms of the benefit that it would have to our community.
So what does the process look like for becoming sensory certified?
There are different ways to do this. We chose to go through an organization called Culture City, who has been around for quite a while, has an incredibly strong reputation, is used in a number of large venues all over the country, and they had just started coming into libraries and doing that work there. There were a couple of other Culture City sensory inclusive certified organizations in Iowa, but no libraries yet. And so we reached out to them, and they had us do kind of an analysis of our spaces and what we were hoping to gain. And then we started the process with what it really meant to do that work here. We had to identify both the places in our locations that could be loud and overwhelming for people with different ways of sensory processing, as well as areas that could be labeled as essentially a safe space for them within the building when they were getting overwhelmed. And if not, being able to identify those spaces, then creating those spaces, and then also incorporating a level of training for all staff from our volunteers and our part-time shelvers all the way up through our administration team to really understand what sensory processing disorders genuinely were, from small children up through adults, so autism and PTSD and kind of everything in the spectrum that worked in those sensory processing areas. And understanding what it was, as well as understanding the appropriate ways to engage with someone who might be struggling because of those sensory processing needs. And so really ensuring that all of our staff was on the same page. There was a requirement for the percentage of anyone who would be formally in our building, staff or volunteers, to be trained before they would label us as sensory inclusive certified, and begin the next part of the process of our social story and the signage to be able to identify these spaces and locations, and the beginning of our sensory bags as well.
You had talked a little about how there were all these different aspects of things you had to do. So what were some of the things in terms of making the physical spaces, like you had mentioned, like the safe spaces? How did you go about creating kind of those environments?
We had a mix of a few different things. Some of it was looking just logistically. Our main library downtown has 2 floors, and so we wanted to ensure that there would be a quiet area on both floors of that, so that patrons who were experiencing some level of discomfort because of the environment around them didn't have to traverse multiple floors to find spaces. We also wanted to ensure that they were relatively near some of our louder areas, but not so in the middle of it that the noise would carry over and continue to be overwhelming even in those spaces. And we also wanted to ensure that they were private. Our library, especially our downtown location, is very glass and window heavy. And so the last thing we wanted to do for someone who was experiencing distress from sensory overload was to put them in a place with windows all the way around them, where either people were watching them in distress or they were still getting visually overstimulated by their environment. In addition, we wanted to either find, or in one case, what we had to do was remodel or renovate a space to ensure that there weren't things in that space that would add to distress or add to overstimulation. One of our quiet areas in our children's library had an automatic hand dryer in it. And that's a really strong trigger for a lot of people with sensory processing concerns, because it's incredibly loud and very sharp, and you can't stop it from happening. We actually had young patrons who wouldn't even enter this room because they didn't want to get anywhere near this hand dryer. And so we actually took a look at that and ensured that that wasn't going to be a barrier for using these spaces. At our branch library, we had to get really creative because their entire ceiling is a drop ceiling. And so there's no soundproofing in any of the spaces in there. And so we actually had to carve out an area back in a partnership space in that library to ensure that there could be a closed door without windows, without the drop ceiling, to ensure that there could be really that private space to process and to decompress before kind of what the next steps were going to be for the patrons.
It sounds like you all really took into consideration like what you had available within both spaces and really worked to accommodate and make a space that was appropriate within the logistics of what you had. I love the part that you had mentioned that you made sure there was one on each floor in one of your locations. The accessibility piece is just huge. You said you wanted to put it kind of near where it's a little bit louder. Is that, I'm assuming, where programming takes place and things like that? That's probably where I would assume would be the loudest section of the library, right? And the most stimulation.
Yeah. So the nice thing is in our children's library, we actually have an enclosed room for a lot of the programming. And so it is near that space. So if the child chooses to come to the program, which we encourage, we don't do sensory specific programming, but instead we encourage everyone to attend our library, and we attempt to make it as safe and comfortable as a place for all events that we do. But if they come and they get overwhelmed, it's a relatively close walk to where this space is, but it's also really near just our general children's library, where we have computers and activities and toys and dress-up areas and just a general level of kind of noise and chaos at all times. On the upstairs of our library, it's near our adult computing area, where again, when you start putting 20, 30, 40, 50 people in a same area, even if the level of noise isn't necessarily overwhelming, the amount of stimulation from multiple people typing, speaking through video conferencing, just that general ongoing din of noise can get to the point where it overwhelms. And so that's where that area was selected to be nearby in our adult area.
You had mentioned that one of the things that you were working on with the certification was the idea of the sensory bag. So how does that look in the library, and how do the patrons get to take advantage of that type of opportunity?
They're a little drawstring bag, and they have a pair of noise-canceling headphones. They have a few different fidget toys. We have a couple that have weighted lap blankets in them. And then there is a laminated card in each one of them that has 2 sides to it. One allows patrons to show us on a scale where they are in terms of either overstimulated or anxiety, kind of from cold to hot, and a scale in between. So if they're having trouble verbally expressing their anxiety and their growing anxiety, they can show us on there. On the other side, it has a list of different things that they might need if they're incapable or unable to communicate verbally. So bathrooms, a quiet area, medical attention, medical assistance, because again, adults can use these in addition to children. If it's a child who is looking for a parent, that's on there. Just that way to kind of communicate those basic needs in the instance that verbal communication isn't possible. These are stationed at multiple places throughout both of our library locations, and they do have signs at those spaces. And we have them to where patrons can just ask for them and we give them to them. We don't want to make people go through the process of finding their library card and maybe not having one, or having fines or lost items and going through all of that. If a child or an adult is getting to the point of potentially being in distress and this can help, we just want it handed to them and used within that moment. And if every year we have to replace a couple $25 sensory bags, that's a very acceptable cost for us, especially because that means that they're likely going home with a family who genuinely has need for these beyond their time in the library. And so fantastic. They have them at home now, and I'm excited for that too. And it's been really nice because we do have families who have either requested them during a crisis situation where a child has escalated and needs an intervention. We've also had those same families come back and preemptively ask for these sensory bags so that they can prevent the child from escalating, which is amazing. But they're understanding that this is going to be something that helps. They are extremely well used in our teen area. They're one of the most popular things that we offer in our teen union because teens today, as opposed to 20 years ago, have such a better understanding of their own mental health. They're so much more empowered to ask for help or discuss it publicly. And so they understand what supports that they need to remain mentally healthy in a space where there's chaos happening around them. And will preemptively ask for those things that will help with that. We've also had staff identify situations that were escalating in both of our buildings and take one of the sensory bags to the family and ask and essentially let them know, here's a resource we have for you. We're going to step away because we know that our presence here is just going to escalate this further, but please feel free to use the things that are in this bag if it's going to help in this situation. And it's often helped de-escalate those situations. It's helped the child focus on something to be able to process a little bit better and resume what they were doing, as opposed to that family feeling like they needed to leave or that they were causing a problem or that they were embarrassed and things like that. They were supported by staff who was given the right tools to be able to work with them, which has been just really exciting for us to see.
That's really great in terms of inclusivity, just because I could see a family feeling so much more welcomed by that response, as opposed to feeling, like you said, like they have to maybe leave the situation. I can imagine that must be really great to feel like the staff is understanding and knows what's happening. So speaking of the training process, you had mentioned that everyone has to be trained, right? Volunteers all the way up to the full-time staff. What does that training look like? I mean, I'm assuming you're looking for, what are some of the signs that somebody might be in distress, but what other types of trainings were provided?
It's a training provided by Culture City. And one of the things that we were over the moon thrilled by is that the instructor in this virtual training is someone who has sensory processing needs. And that's fantastic and talks openly in the beginning about that. And so to have someone who genuinely experiences what they were training about was a really powerful part of that program and something that we really appreciated that was included. It talked about how to identify specific signs of sensory processing needs, not specifically diagnosing patrons. We don't have any interest in playing detective to figure out what your specific need is, but just how do you identify if someone might be struggling with something non-physically, essentially. And then what are the appropriate ways to engage with that kind of preemptively as you see something start to build, in the middle if someone is starting to get really agitated or anxious, and then also if it gets to the point where staff intervention isn't going to be either safe or appropriate, kind of what are those next steps to still ensure the safety of staff and the patron and not escalate it in a way that's going to to have a negative outcome for anyone. And so it was a really eye-opening training, I think, for a lot of people, because many of us have gone through mental health first aid and things like that, but really focusing on how do you move someone into a safe and stable way of using our facility and our materials while accepting the part of their life that is that sensory processing need. It's not a way that we framed things in the past. And so we really appreciated that we have that training and it was required, but then we also have permanent access to that training for new staff as they come on, and we've made it part of our onboarding. And then part of our certification is that we have a refresher training that they provide on a yearly basis that changes year to year. That again, that 75% of all library staff and volunteers are required to take that training. So not only do people get trained once and then get to forget all about it in a couple of years because there's so much that we always are learning, but there's that consistent refreshing of this is what we need to do. This is the impact that it can have. People also have access, if they want a refresher on their own time, they can go back to that initial training or any of the refreshing trainings and watch those repeatedly in order to just kind of remind themselves after 6 months or 8 months, and they want that little bit of an additional reminder, or they had a tough situation and they weren't sure how to approach it, and that they can go back and see, oh, was this talked about in here, and have those discussions too.
I didn't realize that you had to attend training every year. I think that's really important. Because I mean, even as things just start to change, maybe there's something new that comes up that's become an issue that somebody wants to teach about. I think that's great. And I love the fact that you can access it at all times. Because I immediately thought, when you mentioned it just now, but if something happens and you're like, I could have handled that differently, it's nice to have that resource to go back to say, okay, this is what I can do next time to make sure that everyone feels comfortable and supported in an appropriate way. Now, how has that training, you had mentioned that you have inclusive programming, so you ensure that everyone's having access to the same programming and that your quiet spaces are near the programming. How has the training and access to that information changed the way you approach the design of some of these programs?
We've had such a chance to utilize it here in the last 5 or 6 months as we've begun in-person programming again after being closed for almost 2 years during the pandemic. In that, even though it's not diagnosed sensory processing needs of especially younger children under 5, the ability for our younger patrons to interact in the way that they would have with their peers in 2019 is completely different, because we're having kids come in that are 2 or 3 or 4 years old that have had no large group engagement in their entire life. And so a lot of the things that we often put in place to ensure the safety and the well-being of a small number of people with sensory processing needs are now things that we're needing to use for almost an entire group. Things as simple as toning down the volume on things a few notches, where it used to be like, crank that music real loud because it created kind of a fun, raucous atmosphere in here for the kids to dance and play, but understanding that that's going to be too much for people right now. Warning ahead of time if we're going to be doing things that have either sharp noises or things that would be a surprise. Just a really quick aside to parents, especially in those rooms with smaller kids, like, hey, I'm going to read this book. It's really funny, but I just want you to know that about 2/3 of the way through, there's a time where the page turns and I yell really loudly. And so I want you to kind of know that that's coming, and I'll kind of pause before it happens so that you are aware to be able to prepare and comfort your child to the extent that they need that. 10 seconds doesn't change the flow of how things are happening, but it's just that little bit of acknowledging that there are people who are going to process these things differently. Moving some things around, adding additional times for some of our programs if attendance is getting too big, something that we're not doing partially out of health concerns in general, but we're moving away from those programs where we attract 200, 300, 400 people in a room together at the same time, because that's just going to be too much for so many people, and really moving to smaller, slightly more intimate and intentional sessions of things that allow people to progress through them at their own pace. We've really shifted toward a lot of programming that's spread throughout our building. So instead of everything happening maybe in the children's library and there's 300 people walking around in there at the same time, instead it's going to happen over the course of a couple of hours and be across all 3 floors of the building and in different spaces, so that if you get to one and it's just a little bit too much, a little bit too loud, a little bit too busy, you can sort of pivot and go to the next one and do something here where it's a little quieter, and let those families kind of make those choices that are the best and the healthiest for them and their families.
Those seem like really intentional but good changes. And I think you're right with the health concerns with COVID right now. I could see how a lot of that kind of shifts with both. Like, you could be a little bit more sensory inclusive at the same time. It's just kind of catering to what everybody needs at this moment as well. You had mentioned earlier that you have a social story that you had built out through the certification. What does that actually look like, and how have your patrons been using that to support them as they come to the library?
This is one of those parts of being kind of privileged in my life, is that I didn't really know about the existence of social stories until just a few years ago. But this allowed us to build through a structure and a template the ability for patrons to kind of walk through what a visit to the library might look like at either of our locations, visually and with descriptions, before they ever step foot into our spaces. And so it shows them what the entrance to the door looks like. It shows them where those areas that might be noisier. At our downtown location, we have a cafe right in the library, which has an espresso machine, which is, again, another one of those things that creates really unexpected, sharp noises. And so the patrons and kids can know coming in that it's something to expect and to not be worried about. Kind of walks them through where the different areas that might be louder and where our quiet areas are and how to find those. Picture even of the name badge that I'm wearing, which is very vibrantly red. And so it's a nice way for them to see anyone who's wearing this red name badge is someone that you can ask for help if you need it. And so they're not having to worry about, can I ask someone? Who do I ask? Where do I go? And elevate that anxiety and that panic. And so it's just that opportunity to really prepare so that children and adults as well, who don't do well in unfamiliar or new situations, can feel a little bit more comfortable even stepping in the door for the first time. And again, feel welcome to our entire space at any time, rather than feeling welcome at this one designated time in which we've catered everything to a specific need, which is a really powerful thing to be able to do. But it reduces the accessibility of our space during the other 6 days and 23 hours when we're not doing that. And so the social story really has been a very passive way, but really powerful, to allow families to prepare themselves for that initial visit, or even a reminder on many visits of, okay, this was the area where last time we were here, it got a little bit rough. So let's take a look at this and look around and make sure that we're comfortable with what this is going to look like before we move back into that space again.
It's more welcoming. You could prepare yourself for the unexpected almost. This is how it's set up. This is where you can go. These are the people to talk to. That's huge. I was looking at it online, your social story, and I was like, oh, this is really great. Like, they can know exactly where to go and where everything is going to be. And it's just got to be so much more reassuring when they go into that type of a new environment. You've given me a lot of examples of how these changes have been beneficial, but is there like an example that really stands out to you to show, like, I'm so glad we made these changes. This is somebody who really benefited from the changes that we were making?
I inferred about it earlier, but I think the big one that really struck home for me, we had a story sent in from our branch library where I don't spend as much time. And so you never really know if what you're communicating out is really being embodied anywhere, but especially in a place that you don't see regularly. And the story really talked about, they started noticing some noise coming from the back of the library. It's a big open, it used to be a Target, so it's a big open warehouse space, not a lot of walls. And they could hear the noise kind of increasing and escalating, and you could hear the agitation in it. And this was a month or two after we obtained the certification, and they immediately went to, instead of someone's being noisy and we need to make sure that they either stop or they leave, to kind of thinking a little bit deeper about what's the cause of this. And so before even going back to investigate, they grabbed one of the sensory bags and just brought it in case with them. And they were able to go and they were able to observe, based on the training they'd had, kind of what was going on. The child was clamping their hands over their ears. They were physically agitated. This wasn't just, someone being noisy to cause a disturbance. And they were able to have a very brief and very direct conversation with the adult who was there, saying, we have these resources. They're here for you to use. Please feel free if this is helpful. We do have a quiet area if you think that would be helpful to move there. But if moving somewhere is going to be a problem, you're not bothering anyone. Please stay. Please be here. And within probably 5 minutes or so, the child had de-escalated from there, was using both the weighted lap blanket and one of the fidgets. And the parent came up and talked to the staff and said, we very seldom go out places because we're always worried about causing a disturbance. We were on our way out, essentially. Like, we weren't going to stay any longer. And now we feel like we can be here, but also we feel like we can come back. And that this is a place that wants us here and is welcoming to have us here. And that story got sent in, and it was just like, this is like, if nothing else happens with this in the next year, this is worth the entire process, because that family now understands the resource that's there for them, and that we want them in it, and that we're going to do what we can to ensure that they're safe and they're comfortable, because what we have should be open and accessible to everyone and doesn't always feel that way. And this is one of those things that we can really do to ensure that people understand that this space is theirs no matter what else they're facing.
That's a really wonderful example. I'm so glad to hear that. Like, I mean, it's a combination of like the training was great for the staff, and then that one family, that's so great that they feel so welcome in the environment, because that's really what you want an inclusive environment to be. You want everyone to feel welcome. What advice would you give to other libraries or just workspaces in general who are looking to become either just more sensory inclusive or just more inclusive in general?
I think the biggest thing is really just talking to people who are experiencing either themselves or a family member who needs different supports and things like that. That was such an eye-opening thing for us to really walk through our space with the eyes of someone who is looking at it totally different. I'm going to look at 100 different things when I walk through our space, but I was never going to think about the hand dryers. I was never going to think about the espresso machine. I was never going to, realize that this light in this area and that type of light in that area clash to create kind of a pulsing light that can really affect and overstimulate someone, because it doesn't bother me. I'm not looking at it that way. And so being able to really connect with people with that lived experience is going to cause you to understand your own space, your own practices, your own programs differently. And it should, at least if you're interested in serving your entire community, really move you toward action. For us as well, we were dedicated from the beginning to ensuring that we were not going to create a small segment of time where those with sensory needs felt welcome, but to really work to ensure that our entire experience was inclusive of those with sensory needs. And that is harder. I mean, it really is, but it's work that we really believe is worth doing, because we genuinely believe that everyone in our community should have equal and full access to our spaces and our materials. And this is a way that we can ensure that that's possible. And it's a thing that I would encourage other places to really do that hard work instead of what often feels like checking a box because it looks good that you have this 1 hour a week that you're being inclusive. What does it look like to genuinely bake inclusivity into the culture of your organization and to step into that hard work?
I think that's great advice that I hope more places will take into consideration. The fact about just hearing from someone else's perspective, obviously that's huge. There are so many places that are just looking to say, yep, we did it and we're done. But I can hear in your examples the fact that you really wanted to make sure that the library was this inclusive space, and not just saying it's inclusive, but truly being inclusive. So thank you so much for sharing everything that the library is doing. And I hope that our listeners can take something away from it. And I know they will, because there are so many great examples. And I want to thank you so much, Kevin, for being here with us today and sharing.
Thank you so much for having me. It's something we're excited about doing and love to talk to and work with people about.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us on Twitter or Instagram, or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.